All right, we're diving into a really fascinating argument, one that's been gaining some serious ground. The idea is this: what if a central prophecy of Christianity has already been fulfilled? And, maybe more importantly, what does that mean for how believers should actually live their lives, right now?
Now, I know that's a pretty provocative question. It sounds wild, right? But just stick with me here, because this whole idea comes from a fresh look at the scriptures, a rereading that suggests the apocalypse we read about in the New Testament isn't some future event we're all waiting for. No, it's a historical event that we can actually look back on and study.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this is pretty radical rereading. We first have to look at a foundational belief. It's this quiet, deep assumption that's been woven into Christian thought for most of history, so much so that it's hardly ever been questioned. The mainstream Christian view is basically that we're all living in a kind of waiting room. The really big, dramatic, world-changing stuff that Jesus talked about, that's all still out there, somewhere in the future. And that idea shapes everything, from deep theology to the way people pray and what they hope for. The whole system is kind of built on this idea that the final chapter just hasn't been written yet.
But what if that core assumption is just wrong? This is where we get to the heart of the matter, the idea that the prophecy was actually fulfilled. See, a growing number of people who study this stuff are arguing that the New Testament itself points to a totally different timeline.
And this verse right here, this is pretty much the linchpin. It's Jesus' own words, and they seem to put a very specific and frankly a very near-term deadline on his biggest prophecies. He didn't say, some future generation. He said this generation.
So you basically have two completely different ways of looking at this. The traditional reading often kind of explains away words like soon or this generation, right? They become metaphors for something far off in the future. But this newer reading, it's way more direct. It says, nope, Jesus meant exactly what he said. Soon meant soon. And the prophecy was fulfilled way back in the first century. And if that's true, well, that's a genuine watershed moment. It totally changes how you read the New Testament. Those apocalyptic parts, they're not just a roadmap to the future anymore. They're more like a historical account of a promise that was kept. The whole focus shifts from waiting for something to happen to examining something that already happened.
Okay, and this is where it all gets super practical, because this isn't just some dusty theological debate. If the waiting is actually over, then that completely reframes the entire purpose of the Christian community, which leads to the really big question, so what now? What are we supposed to be doing?
Well, when you start looking at history through this new lens, something amazing pops out. A powerful 2,000-year-old pattern. It's like a survival template for how Christian communities have managed to not just endure, but actually flourish, even under incredible pressure, for 2 whole millennia.
The source material calls this posture receiving and displaying. See, the first Christians weren't just passively waiting around, no way. They were actively receiving the gospel, and then they were displaying it through their actions, through their community, through their love for each other, right in the middle of a storm.
And this timeline here just illustrates the pattern beautifully. Look at this. The specific threat is always changing, right? First, it's the establishment in Jerusalem. Then it's the entire Roman Empire. Later, it's Ottoman rule, or hostile governments today in places like China and Iran. But the core response, it's always the same. Believers get together, they support each other, and they build these incredibly resilient communities.
So, okay, what does that resilient response actually look like on the ground? Well, that brings us to what the source identifies as 4 core disciplines. These have basically been the bedrock of Christian survival for centuries.
First up, closing ranks. And this isn't just some, vague, warm, fuzzy feeling of togetherness. We're talking about something really concrete. In the early church, if you lost your job because of your faith, the community literally fed your family. It was practical, it was costly, and it was a direct imitation of how Jesus himself cared for the outcasts.
Number 2 is theological integrity. And the best way to think about this is that metaphor from the Gospel of John, right? Jesus is the vine, believers are the branches. So getting together for worship, it isn't just about keeping each other accountable. It's about staying plugged into the source. Because if you get disconnected, your faith can just wither under all that social pressure.
Third, we've got generational transmission. And this is absolutely crucial. See, faith isn't just a list of ideas you can read in a book or online. It's an encounter with Christ that's transmitted from person to person. It's passed down through real, close, sustained relationships. The kind you can only build when a community is actually gathering together regularly.
And finally, number 4, being a witness to the world. Jesus himself said that the number 1 thing that would mark his followers was their love for one another.
That visible, tangible love inside the community becomes the most powerful proof to everyone on the outside that, hey, something real is going on here.
So all four of these disciplines, they all point to our final idea here, an urgent, timeless imperative. And to get it, we need to take a fresh look at one of the most famous verses in the New Testament about why believers should get together.
Here it is, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, but so much the more as you see the day approaching. Now, for 2,000 years, this has been read as a command to meet up more often as the end times get closer. The gathering is basically tied to a prophetic countdown clock. But hold on, if that day he's talking about already happened back in the first century, does that mean this command has an expiration date? Was this just a temporary order for a crisis that's long, long over?
Well, the source material argues absolutely not. The deeper reason for gathering was never just about a prophetic timeline. It was about something more fundamental, encountering the presence of Jesus Christ in community. That was the one thing, the only thing, that could sustain believers through the crazy, intense pressure they were facing.
So what this really means is that the instruction to meet more isn't about some future crisis. It's about a present reality. It's a timeless principle. And it's this. Real, genuine zeal for Christ is like a fire that's fueled by fellowship, and it just dies out in isolation.
And this powerful quote from the book of Revelation just kind of seals the deal. The Spirit says, from henceforth, from now on, not, until this crisis is over. The work of building community, it has no expiration date. It's a permanent command, and the legacy of that work, the works it talks about, that's what follows believers into eternity.
So we'll end with this question. In our modern, increasingly disconnected world, maybe the logic of the early church is more relevant than it's ever been. What if the most radical, the most countercultural, and the most vital act is simply to gather?